Good afternoon, fellow directors. Is that a little loud? I'd like to start off by acknowledging that I recognize that the CBRD is on the unceded territories, the Coetbin, Malahat, Subasset, Halat, Penalakat, Stunamus, Liaxin, Pakwachin, Ditidat, and Pachidat nations, whose people have walked gently here for thousands of years. I'll turn to our corporate officer for direction, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. First item, order of business is your motion to approve the agenda as circulated.
Do I have it's moved, seconded? Any discussion, additions, deletions? All in favor? It's carried. I don't know at what point to advise the board that Director Rob Douglas regrets he is disposed. He can't make it to today's meeting as much as he tried. So with that, back to corporate officer, please.
And a recommendation the minutes of the Governance Committee meeting of September 4th, 2024 be adopted.
Do I have a motion? Moved, seconded. Anything to discuss? Call for the vote. All in favor? Against? Carried.
And Chair, I don't see anybody in the gallery and online, so we can move past public input period, which really then leads to the single report on your agenda this afternoon, and I'd be happy to go through that with you and facilitate some discussion. Hopefully that is generated from that report.
Thank you, Mr. Robbins.
Is it okay? Would you like me to stand there? Is it okay here? It's comfortable. So the report before you is sort of the culmination of all the work that you've done this past year, and really the main theme is about meeting management. The report lays out a couple of things about what you've done to date to help with your meeting management, and then finally gets into perhaps some next steps that you may want to contemplate and close out the great year in 2024 in terms of meeting management. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the background, but I do want to point out the great work that you've done and remind you in the public of the great work that you've done to date. And actually, it's in order from, you started in 2023 when you were doing the Code of Conduct for elected officials. And that policy went through a number of iterations and drafts through this committee, and you finally adopted that at the beginning of 2024. You did review, a review and an update of a couple of key policies that help manage your public input, and that's the public input period and the question period policies. So when you conduct each of your meetings, as we just went through our agenda this afternoon, an opportunity for the public to provide you input on items on your agenda. And then the other part of that, at the end of your meeting, the public also has an opportunity to ask you questions. And so the body of work that you did was the review and the update of those policies. That was followed by position descriptions. And those positions descriptions are for the chairs, vice chairs of the various committees, electoral area directors, and then municipal directors. And so there was a couple of new ones that were created. The others were reviewed over the course of time. If you recall, you had a facilitated governance workshop and board check-in. That was with Tracy Lawrenson. Is that correct? No, back in July. And then you did a facilitated workshop with Sonia Santa Rosa, who gave you an introduction to your procedure bylaw and a bit of Robert's Rules of Order. And the procedure bylaw is actually part of the subject of the report before you this morning. The other part of the background is simply a reminder of all the other things that help you with the meeting management that are sometimes operational and are behind the scenes, but it's good to remind you of all the other work that is done to help manage your meetings. For instance, the chairs, the CAO and I just met just prior to this, this meeting to review next week's agendas. And so that's a regular occurrence to help manage those meetings, the content, the flow, the position, that sort of thing. Of course, the senior management team also reviews the agendas as a standing item that when they meet weekly. And the senior management team also debriefs on meetings that are concluded to look at the business at hand, the actions, and how we strategize about putting your decisions into action. And the last piece of the background was the technology changes. As you are, most of you might be aware, December 12th, late in the afternoon, this room will no longer be available until the new year. So when you come back after a nice break, hopefully with family and friends, you'll come back to new technology, meaning video and audio. The next part of the how you interact with yourselves and with the public will be meeting management software, the current platform that you're using right now. We're looking to update that and go into a next generation, either of that or of another service provider, but that will provide both meeting management enhancements, but a lot of operational background processes that we use to help put together. You'd be amazed what it takes to put together an agenda, even today's small agenda behind the scenes, in order to organize it in a fashion and then publish it in a way that you and the public can review it and use it to do your business. So that's a bit of the background of where you've been. Any questions about where you've been? How you did? Yes? So the next part in terms of some next steps, and it did sort of rose to the top when you had your workshop with Sonia Santa Rosa, which she went over your procedure bylaw. And so today's report is really about looking for direction to update that. I think in the report I indicate that the bylaw was first developed in 2006. How you do business, how you've discussed business at governance and how you'd like to see it shaped, lends itself for staff to take on the work of updating that procedure bylaw for you. As I mentioned in the report, there are a couple of obvious things that came out, for instance, at the workshop with Sonia, for instance, consent agendas. We sort of do that with omnibus motions right now, but we feel that it's more important to codify those things to help manage your meeting. There was question around the clarity around delegation, time limits, how we approve delegations, and we can manage those a bit better, potentially with some guides or policy, because currently we are using your procedures bylaw, which it doesn't provide a lot of detail, but more importantly, when it comes to delegations, we use convention and practice, board direction, and a bit of discretion in terms of how we manage delegates. Because as you can appreciate, when you went through public input period and question period policies, it was very evident to staff that you wanted the utmost opportunities for the public with which to engage with you. And delegations is one. But we don't want to forget that you have other means with which the public can engage with you. And it's all a matter of a fine balance between being effective and efficient, as I mentioned in the report, providing as much opportunity as you can with which to engage with the community, but also to be effective and efficient around the table to do business. And so some of the procedure bylaw work that we can do at your direction is to add those kinds of things. To the extent we can better define delegations and codify it, we will do that. I think that there's a better opportunity, should you look at the recommendation, is to provide some guides or some more policy work around that as opposed to codify or embed something in terms of managing those kinds of things. The other parts are managing the order of business and take a look at the order of business on the procedure bylaw to make sure that, my words, the priorities, the strategic, the important things are dealt with at the outset. So where you are fresh and you have a good set of eyes on things and you can have a good discussion. Did we want to break for a question?
Well, I'm sorry.
And please, ask questions at any time.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt your flow. You've already spoken a little bit about consent agendas, and, you know, I've been at UBCM and ABICC and different organizations where, let me put it this way, I'm not sold on consent agendas, and I'll tell you why, is there are, when it comes to the public viewing our meetings, it's simple things like, if we're going to be doing electronic voting, I know that we've pulled the public in the past, and they really like to see when directors put their hands up, either in favor or opposed to a motion. With consent agendas, I believe there is a time and a place for them. But I've also been in scenarios where consent agenda's been used, a block of things have been basically approved through the question, is anyone opposed? And I've seen people ask, hang on, what just happened? Where are we now? And so if we're going to be pursuing consent agendas, I think that we should be very specific as to the appropriateness of when and where it's used. And you know, personally, I think that a chair can go through an agenda fairly quickly, even if there is a block, and I think there's a general understanding, for instance, like grants and aid. They can be done relatively quickly, or they can be done as a block. So I'd love to hear everybody's opinions as to whether or not you're using it at your local government, if you've seen it used well, if you've seen it where it hasn't been used well, because when we're being watched, people like to be able to follow along. We put agendas out for people to, so convince me that this is the right thing for this organization to do.
Does anybody want to contribute to Director Morrison's thoughts? Chris?
On the consent agenda, as an example, like they work really well. We're with North Cowichan, and we have every opportunity, as before that's pulled, we have the opportunity to pull items out of that when they are things that need to be discussion. If you aren't paying attention, maybe as Director Morrison said, you could get it where it was something you wanted to speak to, and the chair, or in our case, the mayor, wouldn't have pulled it. But for making efficient meetings, though, it's an extremely important tool. Sometimes there's 20 items in there between, we break it down into areas of item for information, and then also items for decision are built into our consent agenda. So I'm just a big fan of it from the experience I've had with it. But of course, some others here might not, and Director Morrison has some possible valid points on what he said with regards to them, of make sure if you do go towards a consent agenda is you need to pay attention as a board member at the table of, if you want to speak to something, make sure, depending on how that policy is, that you bring it forward for discussion at that time, if that is a policy that's implemented.
Thank you. Director Martman, then
Thank you,
Director
Chair.
Justice. Thank
And
you.
welcome to the chair role.
Thank you.
So my thoughts is that we actually informally do this already. They're called our committee reports to the board. where we accept blocks of information that are published. I think there's a couple caveats I would do is that it really is up to the chair to set the proper flow so that the people are, okay, we're coming up, this is what's on the consent agenda. We do that really well with our committee reports and right now. So I don't think there's any sort of hiccups in terms of people missing something. So I think that's really a chair responsibility. And I think it's really worth to say, I think Director Morrison has a very good point to say, one size does not fit all. There's going to be some agendas that you just go, we're better to go through these one at a time. And I think that, again, I would leave the chair to sort of set that to say, I really want everybody to have a chance to make sure. It could be because we have public in the gallery, we've had a lot of public interest around it. I'm in favor of it, but I think it's, again, I would rely on the chair to really make that specificity of when that happens.
Thank you. Director Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know. I think there's some points that Ian's making. Are we in no, we're in an open meeting, aren't we? Director Morrison. But I think the real advantage of a consent agenda comes when you start having correspondence, and sometimes lots of correspondence on the embedded in a consent agenda, because at that point you don't have to go through each one and make a decision one at a time. And sometimes on our agendas there has been times when there's 15 or more pieces of correspondence that go into a consent agenda, and then sometimes we'll pull 2 or 3 to examine, and the other 12 will just get accepted for information without having to go through them one at a time. So I think without correspondence, there isn't a lot of time savings, I would suggest, because it's just about, usually it's about approving minutes or something like that. So it doesn't, but I think there's a lot of time savings when there's a lot of correspondence on it.
Thank you, Chris. Director Justice. Director Segal.
Thanks. I'm wondering if Mr. Robbins could share if there are best practices for what goes on a consent agenda. I'm thinking items for information, potentially grants and aid, correspondence. Can you elaborate on that?
I think you've just hit the highlights. I'm not familiar with any regional district that doesn't use a consent agenda. When we did our bit of a research to understand how we might help with managing your agenda, and so that is the best practice, but it typically includes those kind of items. Keeping in mind, part of the other recommendation for this was a correspondence policy, because currently our practice in terms of our non-decision making is a distribution, and most regional districts do that as well. And so even with a consent agenda, other regional districts distribute much of their correspondence typically via email, and by either practice or embedded policy. A director certainly receiving that could request a piece of correspondence be placed on an agenda. My experience here for the last couple of years is such, and speaking to Director Justice, is that there's not a lot of correspondence per se that is requesting your decision. But when you have a committee structure, you have bylaws, those often lend themselves to the ability to, for a consent agenda. And the thought about using this was just sort of codify it, because that's the practice. And I guess technically your procedure bylaw doesn't permit that or provide for it. But again, the consensus around the table has provided over the years your ability to do those kinds of omnibus motions. And it is only one piece of the pie. As we work through the correspondence piece as well, then we will be looking at separating the wheat from the chaff to see how we can effectively continue to use our practice with correspondence, and to ensure that we're not missing anything by not placing something on a public agenda, for instance.
Any further follow-up? No. Any other questions from, Director McGonigal.
Thank you, Chair, and as Director Martman said, welcome to the chair position. I I think utilized in the proper way, consent agendas can work, but they're more geared towards municipalities, for instance, with the majority of that correspondence coming in that effect. I'm wondering if perhaps at agenda review that any implementation of consent items might be vetted through that process, where gauging the chair's input of those specific committees, whether or not they feel there is a need for some consent items. Someone's phone is ringing, that's a $50 fine. Payable to, oh, not your phone, your watch, which is connected to your phone. Yeah, it's two items, that's 50 apiece, so, no. In all fairness, I'm wondering if that's a process that could be utilized, should there be a need to look at consent items.
Thank you, Director McGonigal.
So I think that if there is a general interest and we can explore that and bring back how you might want to codify it, how you then might want to practically manage it. I think the reason why this was highlighted is simply because it's a practice right now, and we should be codifying that practice. It's such that is not currently in your procedure bylaw. And then we could have a complementary guide or process that looks at the agendas when they're reviewed as to what does or does not go. If that sort of hits a middle ground.
And a follow-up, if I may. You spoke specifically about bylaws, for instance, and that could be an item for consent follow-up, should that be the case. When we're looking at an agenda like electoral area services, for instance, that comes to the board for approval, it's already been vetted through that committee process, and the bylaw portion has already been possibly approved at a previous meeting. Would that be an avenue for consent items to hurry up that process instead of going through every bylaw and reading every bylaw, as you do a very good job, Mr. Robbins, I might say, or who was my cohort, Ms. Boyd, as well, so.
To the extent that the permissive legislation, Local Government Act permits it, we would do that. There are some statutory requirements and nuances to specifically giving readings. It's the same with, if you notice, just an aside, public hearing minutes. There are minutes where you often just get them for information, but with public hearing minutes, you actually receive them and pass a motion to receive those, because that's a statutory requirement. So to the extent that you can, we will certainly would explore that for sure.
I'm turning to Mr. Robbins. Part of your report today talks about 7 things that we should cover, but you'd like to phase the introduction, unless we want to rush this along and enlist consultants. And I'm wondering whether you could take us through the overarching approach today. Like I sort of identified 7 things that have been identified and 3 phases that you'd like to, I think you're suggesting, with one other observation that we have at present an ad hoc agenda review committee on a week prior to the meetings. And there was some mention that perhaps this committee should contemplate formalizing the agenda review committee.
Albeit for me to create more work for us, but no, and I think that these were certainly suggestions that, do you want to turn your mind to help manage your meetings? And so as I go through the rest of the report, bylaw procedure was certainly one of them. Then we talked about a group of policy work, including some policy work that had been identified already, in particular correspondence policy. We have old policy, we have old practice. A lot of that is not embedded in anything that the board has adopted or an operational policy for that. And I think for transparency and consistency, that piece of policy work, I think, was important not only for us operationally, but for the board in terms of how you deal with correspondence. And it is intertwined, again, with your procedure bylaw. Do you put correspondence on on your agenda? Do we continue the practice as we do in terms of the generally monthly distribution of that kind of type of correspondence? So I think that's important as well. And we also experience questions from the public as to where does my letter go? How does it go? And it is always nice and comforting at least the staff level that if we can have the board perhaps adopt some sort of guide or policy, it helps us explain that process, as opposed to me saying, well, the practice and the convention has always been, and the direction of the board has been this, that, or the other thing. So that's one body of work, the correspondence. The other work that I allude to is meeting time management, and I know there was great discussion about meeting management with this committee related to ensuring that you have good dialogue and some good consensus when you can. You engage the public, but being mindful of the length of your meetings from time to time and the necessity to get through business. And there's lots of business that staff provide to you and bring to you that has timelines and some statutory requirements. And so there is a bit of an efficiency part to it. And so that's another piece of a body of work that we might wanted to get direction on in terms of time management. We talked about agenda items specifically and including delegation requests. There's only a very small section, as I mentioned earlier, in your procedure bylaw on delegations. I think that it would be helpful to flesh that out, whether it's codified or put it into a policy or a guide that this body can recommend to the board. I think that brings me to 5, and you said 7 now.
I probably got a little mixed up. I just put numbers beside various paragraphs. But you do, as you conclude that analysis, you suggest that this best be phased.
And that just simply our workloads, and your workloads for that matter, in terms of introducing lots of things for you to discuss. And so we felt that this is a natural progression to get through to these items for your meeting management. And if you saw the need to firm up your meeting management sooner than later, then we can provide you and let you know what it would cost to get some more horsepower behind that to get it done sooner than later.
Director Segal?
I have a few questions. Happy to support the recommendation. But, okay, delegation management, does that include the amount of time that we spend asking questions, for example? Because I think we have time parameters on how long delegations can present, but sometimes we may go an hour plus after. So is that what you're kind of recommending with regards to?
We've taken the cues from this committee and the practice that we see in your meetings, that yes, that would be one area that we could come back with some guidance. Again, whether it's a policy or a guide that helps you manage the efficiency of yours, to give you parameters. For instance, right now, is it 2/3 or majority vote, you can extend public input period and question period, so that you consciously make that decision based upon your agenda of the day. And certainly we could embed that in the procedure bylaw, or perhaps like the public input period and the question period, to develop that in a guide or a policy for you.
Follow up? So my next thing, I don't know if this is the right time to talk about it, but I'm wondering if our procedure bylaw allows for a vice chair to chair a committee meeting when the chair is present, in terms of providing learning opportunities. Sometimes our chairs are never sick and they never miss, and vices can go a whole year without getting any experience. I'm wondering if our procedure bylaw allows for that, or if that would be a new thing.
Pardon? In the policy. I've got all the policies. So they're in your procedure bylaw 9A, and I'll just quote it from there. The vice chair has, during the absence, illness, or other disability of the chair, all the powers of the chair, and is subject to all rules applicable to the chair. I guess one specific interpretation would mean the chair's there, not there, the vice chair steps in. I don't, practically, if there is an interest for you as the chair to provide those learning opportunities, I'm not sure that explicit you'd be in contravention of that provision, and to the extent, I'm not sure how you would sanction each other for contravening that particular section, if you were literally translating it that way. To the extent you want us to explore changing that, if statute permits it, we could most certainly review that particular section to allow for that. Or, as the case may be, just to adopt a practice.
Right, I'd be interested to know, yeah, what the statutes permit.
I don't believe the statutes are that specific. But we'd have to do that review just to make sure that we weren't in contravention of the LGA, for instance.
Director Deck had,
Oh, sorry.
Following up? Oh, may I?
Yeah.
Thanks. This is regarding correspondence, and I certainly, we all do value the input from our residents, and sometimes we get emails to our inbox, but they're directed at they're directed at all the members of the board, right? So I'm wondering, first of all, maybe why those couldn't automatically be put into correspondence. So just as Mr. Robbins said, the public would know that their letters are being read and they're being acknowledged. Is there an automatic way to do that, or should we be informing the public about how they would get their correspondence in front of the board?
To the extent that we can educate the public about a formal process, we'd certainly do that. But this is one of the sections within the correspondence that we were going to look at, and our deputy corporate officer referring to email etiquette and determining how to, because you're inundated as individuals, as subgroups, as a body of the whole with emails, and we want to help manage that. And so I believe with the policy work that we would like to do, will help define those times when it goes in onto your agenda, when it's distributed as we do currently right now, how you deal with unaddressed correspondence that's outside of your jurisdiction, that sort of thing. So the correspondence work, policy work that we wanted to do would address email etiquette, for sure.
Thank you, thank you.
and Director Martman, did you?
Yeah, I was just following up on Director Seagal's comment about the chair relinquishing the chair to the vice chair. And I thought that this was a practice I've seen in other councils where the chair, for some reason, goes, I'm not, this is an item I want to step out of, I want someone else to chair it, and I want to be able to speak to it as not being the chair of this meeting. And I think I've seen that happen in places. So I guess the question is, number 9 really reflects the absence of the chair. So I think, if this is a practice that it happens rarely, but it happens, it needs to encompass that as well.
I think our CAO has a point to bring up.
Yeah, I think, working with you folks over the past couple of years, there's been lots of discussion about sharing the workload and about mentorship and succession. So those are the two different things that I think you're trying to bring forward. So the other consideration, you can think about more of a co-chair model to spread the workload and also look at developing skill sets more broadly in more people across the committee and the board. But there's also a lot of people that are probably needing a bit of time to really find their footing in the chairing role. And so there's that you have to consider as well, that you need the time in the seat and kind of learning by doing. And so we don't want to necessarily compromise that process either. So just some thoughts about what do you want to accomplish, I guess, with having the kind of a more of a co-chair model. And then we can kind of try to build it from there.
Director Morrison?
This is an interesting discussion because, well, things are different. We have elections every 4 years. All best laid plans can be interrupted by our public's will as to who sits at this table. But I think there's a pretty simple fix to this, and I've thought about this. And it's really a case of I don't think it's wise to have the chair of a committee in the room and have the vice chair sitting in the and running the meeting. I think a far better approach would be if it was an appropriate meeting and a new vice chair was eager to step in and to begin to learn the role, that it would be if the practice was approved by by the board, that the vice chair could step in and the chair of that committee simply attend virtually. And that way it's clear, there's no confusion as to, the person sitting in the role is the person running the meeting, and there isn't any confusion at that point. I'd be more than willing to, with the appropriate work with my vice chair, attend remotely, have him in the chair at EASC, and I think that is a better and more respectful way of going about this, and we can try that as a practice before we put it into a specific policy.
Thank you. Director Segal.
I wanted to elaborate on the co-chair model, because I think in terms of the chair of the board, we're not allowed to do that, according to legislation, right? There has to be a chair and a vice. But Ms. Miles Wilson, you're saying can we do that for committees? Like we could fully create a co-chair model?
When I'm referring to co-chair, I'm thinking that it's kind of the principle that you're trying to bring into it more, where you're working more as a coalition and a chairing group. Like even when we do agenda reviews, we have a committee that reviews it. It's the chairs that come together, and that's something that's kind of been instituted, even if by convention, over the past couple of years. And so what I was reflecting on, the purpose of it, what I've heard from all of you is that you wanted to support the succession and mentorship, but also wanted to look at how we spread the workload throughout the group a little bit more, because it is a lot of business that we're running through the organization. And so even if not formally, it's still a convention, like a practice that we're using. And so that was kind of what I was referring to. We still need to identify a chair, but then how we, behind the scenes and within our policy and procedures, how we manage the workload is another conversation.
We have a question from Director Jesse McClinton.
A comment and a question. Yeah, just as the vice chair of EAS, I'd just be looking to get 1 or 2 meetings in max in the year. And so if Ian doesn't get sick, maybe trying to schedule one in before the end of the year, I think would be appropriate. That was my hope at taking the position. So for whatever that's worth. I have a question around extending time for delegates, but I'll save that.
Thank you, Director McClinton. Any more questions at this point? Director McGonigal.
More of a comment, and I think the aspect of a co-chair model was to spread the work, as was stated earlier, but also to accommodate successorship. Some of us may not be around here forever. Maybe Ian will, but some of us may not be. And I think with a little bit of experience in the interim, that those who remain after next said election cycle could step into that role. We've utilized a core group within the committee chairs for the last 5 or 6 years, and you're probably getting sick of my jokes by now, but I am no longer a chair of a committee, and we'll have to rely on Mr. Robbins for the humor from now on. But just looking at the future, whether it be next year or the year after, how a new person could step into that chair while not chairing a meeting. And I think it would all depend on whoever becomes the chair of the board next year and who they appoint as committee chairs. So if he or she appoints people who have never chaired a meeting before, would that be good meeting management? So the whole intent is not to take away the position of chair or vice chair. It's just to accommodate the workload share.
Thank you for that sage advice. Any other, Director Segal.
Thank you. Thank you, Director McGonigal. I think it's clear around the table, we're looking to encourage collaboration and that successorship. And it's also clearly our practice. I guess what I'm looking for is into the future, are there things that can be included in policy or bylaw, I'm not sure, where it's appropriate, that like continues that into next election, and who knows who's around this table. I don't know if, so that's that opportunity I'm looking for, just for staff to hear that. And then my last thing was just a note from Sonia Santarosa with our workshop. She said that most regional districts don't have a separate committee procedure bylaw and a board procedure bylaw. And so would combining that be a part of this said work, or is that kind of additional down the road plan?
Mr. Chair, just back to the collaborative, I think that obviously if you codify, you are signaling to the future that that's something that you want to do. Policy has some bite, but it is easily changed, if you will. And then certainly lots of things that we do are by practice and convention. And so I leave that for the direction. If you want to codify it, or policy, or a start to adopt a practice, and you might find that the practice gains a lot more traction and consensus that is a model going forward, and then you can certainly make those changes and those leaps, my words, leaps to a policy and or codify in a bylaw.
Director Staples, please. Michelle, are you online? Hands up.
I am sorry. I just dropped my phone and it shut it off. So yeah, essentially, just to follow along with some of the things that are being said, I really think that the co-chair model, recognizing the limitations that we have, I think it's really important because I've been around for a little while in all of this, and there's been times that, you know, mayors have gotten sick or chairs or something happens in their lives or whatever, but people need the experience to step into those roles. And also people need, as a co-chair, or vice chair, working as a co-chair, I think that it's something, this governance structure has been set to change for a long time. There's been talk about that. I hear talks of co-chairs, you know, all over, particularly in terms of once nations start to come to the table and how do we address that. So I think starting to practice that as much as we can is important to kind of start signaling that, you know, these are changes that we're interested in. And it is, I feel like it's just so much more beneficial. So yes, there's the chair, but then to make sure that the other person has opportunity to chair meetings, to, you know, speak to the press, to do all those things that they may be called on to do last minute, to build in as much kind of mentorship as we can into these roles, I think is really important and benefits everyone.
Thank you, Director Staples. And being new to this seat, I could not agree more. It's a good experience. Director Justice.
Thank you. Just for clarity, following up on the Director Staples, are we prevented by provincial legislation from going to a more formal co-chair model where, yes, I'm seeing nods, yes, we are. So that's the LGA says there has to be a chair and a vice chair. But within that structure, would we be able to create a situation where the chair and vice chair essentially acted like co-chairs, split the extra remuneration, and alternated chairing meetings?
Mr.
Would
Robbins,
that be
please.
within our power?
Likely, I'm not sure how prescriptive the LGA, and I think that Danielle might provide the quote. Certainly at the committee chair, because the committee and the committee structure is at the leisure currently of the chair to that structure, and it is not codified or referred to in the LGA. And so at the very least, you'd be able to do that. And we would certainly make sure that if you wanted to get as close to that kind of model with the chair and the vice chair, then we would do everything we can to see if we can.
Ms. Miles Wilson.
So I just wanted to clarify that the wording in our procedures bylaw comes out of the Local Government Act. The wordings looks to be exact. I'd have to, sit down with Patrick and obviously go through all this. But so when we talk about the vice chair has, during the absence, illness, or other disability, all the powers of the chair and is subject to all the rules applicable to the chair, that's right out of the legislation. So there's further direction in the legislation about the specific responsibilities of the chair. So we would have to do some analysis on where that's, to make sure we're compliant, basically, because it's very specific. You're meant to have a chair, and the chair is the chair, and the responsibilities are within that person's hands. Unless they're ill or not available, then it would go to the next. So it isn't really set up to have that officially shared. But as for running a meeting, there's maybe, after some analysis, there may be ways in which you can activate that within reason, but it's not, the co-chair model is not something that's really clearly allowed under this piece of legislation. But we can explore it and maybe get some advice and then come back and let you know, I guess, what would or wouldn't be possible.
Thank you. And I think Director Morrison painted a path forward for practicing it. So, thank you. Director Martinman, please.
Thank you, and I just wonder at what point do we say, the legislation, it needs to be more current, and we take some advocacy with a resolution to the appropriate channels.
I'm going to turn to our corporate officer and just get a...
I was going to say, because it came up just moments ago about especially how you will collaborate with First Nations, for instance, and the importance of that. And the legislation isn't providing for that right now, and so your advocacy is well timed with that and modernizing those roles for sure.
The other thing I'll remind you of is that you wrote a letter in support of the legislative reform initiative that's being led by the Regional District in Nanaimo. So we wrote a letter supporting their request to ask the UBCM to set up an executive task group to actually look at reforming the LGA. So that work has been going on for quite some time, and I'm not sure if the UBCM is in a position to respond to that request yet, but there's a movement afoot to change a lot of things about this piece of legislation.
So we've chatted considerably about the chair role, co-chair role, and Mr. Director McGonigal has...
I'm going to move the recommendation, Chair.
There was one outstanding question that I hadn't got to. Sorry, I didn't.
I'm very sorry. I was
No,
out
I'm
of the
sorry.
room. No, I'm sorry.
No. There was a question whether or not, what the practice is with regards to separate procedure bylaws for board and for committee commissions. And we identify that in the report as well. There's a little more nuance to it when it comes to committees and commissions, because there are other bylaws that are related to some of your commissions, the service establishments, that set up your commissions. There are terms of references related to those. And so that was a bigger body of work. You're right, the practice is that they would be combined, but we are suggesting that that's another phase. There we go. There's a number 6 that would, Chair. So we're almost to 7. So that body of work that we needs to be done, but there are some nuances that need to be analyzed, and you'll need a better briefing on how they interrelate, and even remind you, surprisingly probably, of some of the things that are in the bylaws and in the terms of reference that aren't being practiced today, that you may want to eliminate and you may want to revise or start doing.
Director McGonigal.
And with that, I will move the recommendation. Thanks for the clarification on that outstanding question.
And are you seconding?
I have a question first.
Can we have a seconder? We got it seconded. Any questions to the motion?
Yeah, I think Director McClinton may have a follow-up too, because he mentioned about delegations, and I just wanted to briefly get some direction or ideas where this might be going around delegations, because we go through the process of, at the end of 10 minutes, we renew or not. But it doesn't seem that we leave it open-ended, I believe. I don't think anybody I've ever heard saying you have another 10 minutes or you have another 5 minutes. So I don't know if that's part of what what we're voting on, that they will come back with some ideas on that. And maybe Director McClinton, because I think he had something about delegations.
Mr. Robbins?
We were contemplating in the work that we were going to do and bring back some recommendation is looking at those kinds of guides in terms of timelines.
Director McClinton, did you want to contribute?
Yeah, that's bang on. Like, my understanding was we give them 10 minutes and then renew for another 10 minutes. I mean, do we want to stick to 10-minute delegations? I don't know, maybe 8 minutes and give them 4 or 5. I mean, I would be open to any sort of it just seems like though they can drag out. There's certain people that are very on top of it, but there's lots that aren't. And so, instead of just giving them a blank check for another 10, maybe something much shorter would be my suggestion. And can we do that?
I think staff wish to contribute something.
No, just an observation is staff can work with the presenter to make sure the presentation is within a certain time limit, but I think the majority of the time spent is actually on the discussion. That's where you're going the hour. And not to say in all cases, but I would say that's an observation is usually you're quite interested in the people that are coming before you and you want to have a conversation. So there's other ways which we can consider how to manage that. We can set certain meetings to allow that conversation so that it doesn't impact the schedule and the business in front of you. There's different things we can consider, but it really is at your discretion. Like, do you want to have that kind of length of conversation, or do you want to define it more?
I wondered if we might read back what the motion is. Is it verbatim what's been recommended in the staff report? And have we had enough discussion on all elements? I guess we have. Ready for the question? All in favor? Oh,
I'm happy to read it out.
Thank you, Director Sakal.
That it be recommended to the board that CVRD bylaw number 2889, Regional Board Procedures bylaw 2006 be amended to include provisions for consent agenda, order of meeting agenda business, clarity on meeting delegation management, and 2, that board policies be developed for correspondence, agenda item management, and for meeting time management.
Are we ready for the question? All in favor? Opposed? Nobody's opposed. Passed unanimously. Thank you. What's our next order of business, Mr. Robbins?
Question period. Again, no one's in the boardroom with you and or online, so an adjournment. And
Motion to adjourn. A motion to adjourn. Thank you. Second. All in favor? We're out of here.